We're really happy to be here to be talking about this project. As Mike said, today we'll be discussing an ongoing effort to identify and research pioneering early Black students at Yale. For now, the list that we've compiled over the last several months goes from the 1830s to the year 1940 and includes around 224 students. We've found photographs or illustrations of around 159 of those students as well. As part of this project, we've attempted to identify as many Black students who attended Yale during these first 100 years or so as possible, to find what we can on their lives, their careers, their social and family networks, and as I said, find images of them if possible. The brief profiles of students that we've compiled so far are presented in print in the Shining Light on Truth exhibit at the New Haven Museum, which is opened through this summer with free admission. And we are also expecting to share these profiles online in the near future to make them more broadly accessible. And we really hope that this is a catalyst and a foundation for future research. This is something that we've talked about a lot as we've worked on this project, that it is necessarily an ongoing project that will probably never be finished completely, but something that can be built on for many years to come. And I want to note too that Chaz and I are talking about this project today for Mondays at Beinecke, but many others contributed research, writing, and editing and more to this project. And I want to recognize them, particularly Hope McGrath, Simone Felton, Kaching Tan, and Allison Van Ree. And we're also very grateful to colleagues at the Yale School of Medicine, the Yale School of Law, and the Yale Divinity School, in particular, Joan Duffy and Graziano Kratley, who helped locate images and names of students as part of this project. So to start, we thought we would talk a little bit about the research process behind this project. And I wonder, Chaz, if you could start us off talking a little bit about your process to identify many of the names. I know that you did a lot of the initial work to compile this list of students that we would then be going on to research. Could you talk about that?
Sure. I thought it would make sense to start compiling a list of people that I had known from various sources, whether they be, historical accounts or biographies, but to compile a list of Black students who had attended and or graduated from Yale. And then, once we started talking about it amongst the team, Michael had a list of names, and then we started to compile the various individual lists into, one long list. And I think really Hope, what was instrumental in that was the way that you sort of organized that information and putting it into a database. But certainly, I think one of the largest resources would be old historical African-American newspapers, personal accounts of people's lives, and then whatever published information, whether it be biographies or articles from journals about early African-American scholars that would usually indicate where a person had been educated.
And I know that we also came across some names through the alumni files that we were using as we were researching one person. We would find additional names of people to look into. And I know that Hope and I also found a few names through searching digitized Yale catalogs and directories. We noticed that many of the names that had been identified were people who had previously attended HBCUs and then come to Yale for graduate programs. And so we were able to use that keyword searchable digitized content to search by the names of those schools to identify students that had come to Yale from HBCUs as well. And I think that turned up a few additional people too. Could you talk a little bit about sort of moving into how we were doing the research about individual students once we had a good list of names to start with, um, what it was like diving into the alumni records, into other sources here at Yale or beyond that you were relying on for that research?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the alumni files because really that's where a lot of the gold was mined. And I must say, it was your suggestion about taking a look at the alumni files, and the first box and the first name that we called, and then the first box and file that we went into, the amount of information that was provided in those alumni files and then in the student files was so complete in a way that would allow one to do further research. It was just sort of set the way that we were really able to kind of formulate a specific plan to do this research. And after getting into that first alumni record, that set the game. And then, I would like to recognize a person, Marion Phillips, as you know, Jennifer, who was the longtime alumni secretary here at the university. And her work was so complete, and the lengths at which she went to collect information on former students and former graduates throughout their lifetimes, and writing internationally. And then even asking, in the case of African American students, students who she knew were African Americans, asking them about other African American students who they may have been in school with contemporaneously, gave us other names to add to our list of Yale students. So it's hats off to the alumni office and certainly Marion Phillips for her diligent and intrepid work.
Yeah, for those listening who aren't familiar with these Yale alumni files, these are files that were kept by the Yale Alumni Office that include everything from student applications to Yale, any correspondence with the alumnus and the alumni office, surveys that students filled out periodically for content for class books or for alumni directories. So they would be sent in the mail, these surveys, where they would fill out information about their careers, their families, what they had been doing since graduating. And it's a really rich resource to go through. There's also everything from just address updates of where they're living. They want to let the alumni office know where they can be reached, requests for football tickets. It's a really, it's sometimes surprising how much we found. And we definitely came across many places where the alumni registrar, Marion Phillips, had gone to great lengths to track someone down when a letter came back, returned to sender because it was a incorrect address. And other sources I know that we relied on a lot were, in addition to the alumni records, the yearbooks. Many of the photos that we found as part of the project came from yearbooks, but also a lot of the basic biographical information about where people were born, when they were born, what their plans were after they graduated from Yale. Yale catalogs, directories, the Yale obituary record, which is a great resource that was printed up until 1953 and includes obituaries of Yale graduates by year. And that was a great source of biographical information. And I know we also relied a lot on ancestry and family search and other online sources of digitized vital records. We were looking at census records, birth and death and marriage records, military records, draft registration cards was something that in this period came up a lot. You had mentioned digitized newspapers and other publications. We found a lot of digitized publications from other schools in HathiTrust and in the Internet Archive, which are online resources of digitized historic materials. And those were really key in piecing together what other schools students had attended and sort of what their careers and academic life had been like. And I know we also relied in some cases, in some cases, these were very prominent people who had attended Yale and there are whole books written about them. And so it wasn't so much a problem of not finding enough information as it was narrowing it down to what we wanted to include in these brief profiles. There were also oral histories for some of the people on our list, and also in some cases, information that had been passed down within the local community that had been shared through oral histories, through memoirs or things written online by descendants or by family members. Do you want to talk a little bit about how all these pieces sort of fit together?
Well, sure. One of the things you sort of jogged my memory, and this was really impressive, in relation to the alumni files. In the case of Charles Smithwick, who was an early African-American graduate of the Yale Law School, in order to track Smithwick down, the alumni office at one point just starts looking for anybody in, I guess, America whose last name was Smithwick. And so in one case, a letter is written to a white gentleman in Pennsylvania who was a Smithwick, and then he writes back to the alumni office that he didn't recall a person, that he wasn't African American, but that he recalled a young man in North Carolina with the same last name who was the son of a gentleman who had been enslaved by his mother. And it's so interesting to see in the students' alumni records that there's even a connection back to the period of enslavement through simple correspondence, letter writing, and just, rudimentary queries. And I thought it really sort of emboldened and underscored the importance of good record keeping. And then also, again, another sort of grateful moment that Yale was so intrepid about keeping really good and full records. But I think it's also important to your point about the importance of local stories and talking to people and taking time just to sort of ask extra questions based on things that may seem to be, official information. You learn extra things to be able to go back and further research. And so I must credit many of the living descendants of people who we were researching for taking time to be available for interviews and email back and put up with me being sort of nosy about their families for us to be able to do further research. And so while we're talking to anybody who may really be embarking on this sort of a journey, using genealogy and then being brave enough to reach out to people and let them know what you're working on and what you're doing, and you'd be surprised about the number of responses and the kind of information that will come back.
Absolutely. I think we're going to shift soon into highlighting some of the students that we researched as part of this project. But we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the sort of things we've been thinking about in terms of limitations with this research, and some of the questions that we've talked a lot about what we don't know, what we may not ever be able to know as part of this, and how the sources that we're using shape the content of the profiles that we've compiled of these Yale students. We know that the list that we have so far is incomplete. We know that there are other students from this time period whose names we have not come across in our research. And, we know that students' self-identified race was not consistently recorded in Yale records. And in some cases, students may have identified their race differently in different contexts, or changed the way that they identified themselves, in the records over time. And so there are challenges in this work to identify people and to find the names of people that would be included in this first 100 years period. And so we definitely see this as ongoing work that we hope that many people will be inspired to participate in and contribute to as it's ongoing. And we, of course, found more information about some people than about others. Yale tended to keep more consistent alumni records on people who graduated than those who had only spent a semester or a year on campus. And of course, there's more information about people who went on to prominent, long public-facing careers than there might be about others. And also, we've thought a lot about the way that, a lot of the information in these profiles that we've collected is coming from Yale sources, like the ones that we've described. And most of these sources, the class books, alumni records, the directories, the obituary record, those relied on information that was provided directly by the student, or in some cases by a family member or a relative, particularly in cases where the alumnus had passed away. So in some ways, these are, kind of rare sources where we're getting to see people describe their background, their academic careers, their professional lives, their families in their own words, in ways that we wouldn't find elsewhere, for example, in census records or in birth and death records and things like that. But at the same time, we recognize that this is mediated by the institution in some ways. They are writing about themselves, but they're responding to specific questions that are posed by the Yale Alumni Office in many cases that tend to focus on academic and professional achievements, family life, and tell us less about their community involvement, activist work that they might be involved in, social networks and other aspects of their lives that just aren't covered in the scope of that. And so other sources like the Black newspapers that you were talking about earlier, Chaz, and community and family memory really do a lot to fill in some of those gaps and kind of put together the pieces of the puzzle.
I also think it's a good, this is a good place to also mention the importance of record keeping by those institutions like historically Black colleges and universities, their yearbooks, publications maybe that they produced, also historical Black organizations, church organizations, certainly the publications of the historical Black Greek letter organizations that would have taken an interest and taken the time to write about their, various members. Those were invaluable resources that gave us so much more color to the lives of these individuals outside of, just simple biographical information.
Yes. Oh, those were really valuable sources that I found we were turning to frequently to fill in some of those gaps, especially. So I think at this point, we'll turn to sharing some of the stories of people that we have come across as part of this project. And I think that Chaz is going to get us started with William Fletcher Penn.
Oh, I'm so happy to be able to present on William Fletcher Penn, Dr. William Fletcher Penn, a graduate of the Yale School of Medicine in 1897. Dr. Penn came from a family, obviously, that had come out of the institution of slavery in Amherst County, Virginia. And Dr. Penn, obviously the legacy of education was strong in his family. He had a brother who was a medical doctor, and then he also had a brother who was a very important official in religious work and really interracial religious work through the Methodist Episcopal Church. And so I think it's important to note that that sort of culture of educational excellence in the family pushed Dr. Penn to attend Hampton Institute in Virginia. And then from Hampton, he went on to study at what is now Virginia State University. And wanting to pursue the field of medicine, he attended a school that is not so well known now, but would be a part of the group of historically Black medical educational institutions like Howard School of Medicine and like Meharry School of Medicine, but this one was in North Carolina in Raleigh, and it was affiliated with Shaw University, and that school was Leonard Medical School. And eventually Leonard closed, but before that, Dr. Penn pursued studies at the Yale School of Medicine, and he entered that Yale School of Medicine in 1894. And here's a picture of Dr. Penn with his classmates. And he is at the top row, second from the left, a tall gentleman. And then you see at the top row, there's another Black gentleman all the way at the end, and that is Dr. Arthur Leslie Howard, a classmate, and his roommate for the time that they were here at Yale and medical school. Dr. Penn was voted he was voted the meanest man in his class. And, you know, it makes me wonder after all of this research, why exactly, you know, he would have felt the need to be perceived as mean. And then it's interesting, Dr. Penn was very instrumental in his classes yearbook as a leader, and was respected as a fine clinician. Dr. Penn, after graduation from Yale in 1897, entered the medical field in the city of Atlanta. And while he was in Atlanta, he served as the college physician at Clark University, which is now a part of Clark Atlanta University. Dr. Penn also was the founder of an early Black hospital effort in the city. And that institution was called the Fairhaven Infirmary, and that was located on and near the old Morris Brown College campus, near the old Fourth Ward. And Dr. Penn certainly was a civic leader, very active in trying to restore law and order, and then get justice for people who had been victims of the 1906 Atlanta race massacre. And kind of inspired by those experiences, as you can see in this picture, we have the founding members of the Atlanta chapter of the NAACP, which was formed, I believe, in 1917. And Dr. Penn is the tallest gentleman in the back row. And in front of him is sitting Louis T. Wright, Dr. Penn's stepson. And I want to point out that the legacy of medicine in the family was certainly emboldened by Dr. Penn. And eventually, Dr. Penn moved on to Tuskegee, where he was the chief of surgery at the Veterans Hospital. And there's a picture of the Veterans Hospital there. And this is a picture of Dr. Penn's son-in-law, and this is Dr. Harold D. West, who went on to become the first African-American president of Meharry Medical College. Dr. Penn's daughter, Jessie Penn, married Dr. West. And in this photo, you have a picture of, in the middle, Dr. Louis T. Wright, who, in addition to being a medical sort of dynamo and first leading Harlem Hospital and overseeing major cancer research and treatment, and also at the same time served as the national chairperson of the NAACP's board of directors. And Dr. Wright is in the picture with his two daughters, Dr. Barbara Wright Pierce and Jane Wright Jones, both fine physicians who made a dent in the treatment of cancer and in cancer research. But my point by showing the family is really just to point out how the influence of Dr. Penn was not only felt in his community, but certainly in his family. And both of his children have descendants who are living today, who have gone into medicine in various ways and still continue to live out Dr. Penn's medical legacy, which I would say certainly was formed and shaped at Yale Medical School. In fact, his time at Yale Medical School really pushed his stepson to pursue medical school at Harvard University, and that's where Dr. Wright graduated from. And then the next early Yale African-American students I'd like to focus on are the Bonner family. And I thought it was important to highlight the Bonners because not only do you have one person sort of breaking through insurmountable odds to make their way to Yale and then then graduate from Yale, but here you have a family of folks, the Bonners and Frederick Douglass Bonner, as you can see, graduated in the class of 1901 from Yale College. And he was the son of a man named Willis Bonner, who was a carpenter, but had come from North Carolina. And Willis Bonner was a Republican sort of political operative in New Haven and a leader in the community. So I'm sure the influence of Willis Bonner on the lives of the children. And as you can see, Frederick Douglass Bonner, Willis Bonner, in his capacity as Republican operative and leader, hosted Frederick Douglass when he came to New Haven. And so I'm sure that's one of the reasons why this gentleman here, his name is Frederick Douglass Bonner. But Frederick Douglass Bonner, upon graduation in 1901, moved to the Philippines with his family, where he entered the field of education and eventually became a superintendent of education in the Philippines, as well as serving as the postmaster in several locations. And then upon returning to the United States in 1917, he became an accountant and lived in Massachusetts with his family. And interestingly enough, also living in Massachusetts at the time was Robert Bonner. And Robert Bonner, from New Haven, both Bonner brothers attended New Haven High School, which is now James Hillhouse High School. And Robert Bonner was the first in that family to attend Yale, and he graduated from the Yale School of Art in 1896, where he was a prize-winning student and a member of a quartet of Black students at various schools. The quartet was comprised of various students throughout Yale University, and they performed traditional African-American songs and Negro spirituals, and they toured around. Robert Bonner went on to practice law, and he was, I would say, a very brave person and a visionary. He was a part of a special group of African-American leaders who were pushing for full citizenship rights, concentrating on concentrating on safeguarding the right to vote and practice that right to vote. And he was a member of the group that we call the Niagara Movement. And you can see here in this picture, Robert Bonner with outstanding American individuals, leaders in the national and international Black diasporan community, people like educator John Hope, Clement Morgan, the attorney from Boston, W.E.B. Du Bois, and intrepid entrepreneur Alonzo Herndon. But Robert Bonner is next to Du Bois at the end, on the right side of the picture. And so he kept up with the group and kept up as a civil rights activist for the rest of his life. And he is actually buried in New Haven's Grove Street Cemetery. And not only did the two brothers attend Yale, but Frederick's son, Frederick Willis Bonner, attended Yale and graduated with the class of 1929. And he went on to a career in teaching. But the interesting thing about Frederick Willis Bonner is that he was noted to be the first African American graduate that was a son of an African American graduate. So I guess in another way, the first Black person to be a Yale legacy graduate. And in addition to just the family members with the last name of Bonner, Harkening back to the alumni files and the importance of the information that was in the alumni files, we find that the Bonners were also cousins to two other students at the university, and then I'm following up, but it looks like possibly three. And those two students I'll mention, while we're not really featuring them, are the brothers Edward Peyton and James Peyton, who were early 1900 graduates of the college, one in 1900 and then one in 1906. And then the other person is Stephen Hill from the class of 1904. So when you talk about excellence and the importance of education, the culture of education in families, this is a fine example of what happens when you have people who are sharing and impressing upon others around them what greatness and excellence looks like.
Thank you, Chaz. I'm going to highlight a few additional students that we found as part of our research on this project. William Ashby was born in Virginia. After graduating high school, he went to New Jersey and received tutoring from an alumnus of Lincoln University, John Locklear. And he then went on to Lincoln University himself, graduating with a bachelor's degree in 1911. And he had an experience shortly after this. He was working as a waiter in Newark, New Jersey, and went to hear the socialist activist, labor leader, and presidential candidate Eugene Debs speak. And he was inspired by this speech to dedicate his life to serving and advocating for the oppressed. He then entered the Yale Divinity School, and he graduated from the Divinity School in 1916. And at Yale, he joined the Zeta chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. And he also is noted as being, as a student in 1915, he invited Booker T. Washington to the New Haven meeting that would eventually turn out to be the Washington's final public appearance before his passing. After graduation, Ashby returned to New Jersey and he began a career in social work, and he is recognized as New Jersey's first Black social worker. He founded the Newark Welfare Foundation and Community Chest, which was a forerunner to the United Way. And he also founded the Fold Neighborhood House in Newark and founded and directed the first Urban League offices in New Jersey, and served as director of Urban League offices there and in Illinois from 1917 to 1953. He was involved in many other things in New Jersey, including he's serving on the New Jersey Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission in the early 60s. He was a co-founder of the Newark Preservation and Landmarks Committee, and he was also a member of the Newark Human Rights Commission. And it's interesting to note, too, in thinking about the networks of Yale alums that we've been talking about, as part of this work, during this period in Newark, it's interesting to note that the director of the Newark NAACP was also a Yale Divinity grad at the time, John Dillingham Jr., and also the industrial secretary for the Urban League in New Jersey, who, no doubt crossed paths with William Ashby in the course of his work, was Roy Norris, who had also attended the Divinity School. Edward Morrow was a graduate of the Yale College class of 1931. He attended the University of South Dakota for 2 years before transferring to Yale in 1927. And for a period of time, he was the only Black undergraduate student at Yale. And in 1927, he was the only undergraduate pledge to the Zeta chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha, which at the time was predominantly made up of graduate students. He was a contributor to the Yale Daily News in his time at Yale. And we found a letter in the W.E.B. Du Bois papers from Morrow from 1930, where he writes to Du Bois explaining that he has an upcoming Model League of Nations assembly in which he's been appointed to represent Liberia. And he explains to Du Bois that because he believes that he will be the only Black delegate at the assembly, and he has been appointed to represent an African nation, he's especially anxious to do well at this assembly. And he asked Du Bois for any information that might be useful in representing Liberia as part of this Model League of Nations assembly, and also for permission to quote from some things written by Du Bois about Liberia. And he notes that it was suggested to him to reach out to Du Bois by another Yale alum, Gaylord Howell, who graduated from Yale College in 1920, and his wife, Christine Moore Howell. And so again, seeing where sort of networks of Yale alums in contact with each other, in support of each other while he's a student. And according to a 1929 letter that Morrow wrote to a classmate during his time at Yale that is now in the archives here at Yale, he struggled to cover his tuition and living expenses at Yale after being passed over for a scholarship the previous spring before writing this letter. And in 1988, Morrow was interviewed for the New Journal at Yale. And he says, quote, "Yale was phasing blacks out. They froze them out financially, froze up their loans. Yale was Jim Crow and pro-Hitler and fascist as far as I was concerned." So clearly a very frustrating time for him, and something that even, as in 1988, many years later, was something that he carried with him and remembered about his Yale experience. And in the same interview, he reflects on the sort of social isolation that he felt at Yale, and says that he spent many of his weekends while a Yale student in New York. He says, "We went over the hill to Harlem and to life. We came down to a Harlem that welcomed us." Following his graduation in 1931, Morrow worked as a journalist in Harlem, interviewing major artists and musicians associated with the Harlem Renaissance. And it's believed that he encouraged the cartoonist Ollie Harrington, who is currently featured in an exhibit here at the Beinecke, to apply to the Yale Art School. And Harrington graduated from the Yale Art School in 1940. Morrow also, during and after World War II, worked in public information for the Army. In one of the alumni surveys that's in his alumni file, he describes his work as writing and fighting. At the time that he was interviewed in 1988 by the New Journal at Yale, he was noted as the oldest living Black graduate of Yale. And he passed away in 1999 at nearly 100 years old. And the last alumnus that I'll highlight today is Charlotte Crawford Watkins, who is a New Haven native, born in 1913. Her parents were George Crawford, who many of you may be familiar with, especially if you live in New Haven, and Cedella M. Donaldson Crawford. Her father was also a graduate of Yale, a graduate of the Yale Law School in 1903, who was appointed clerk of the New Haven Probate Court. He worked in private practice as an attorney in New Haven for many years, and in 1954 was appointed the Corporation Counsel for the City of New Haven, an office that he held until 1962. And Charlotte Crawford was a graduate of Wellesley College, and this picture of her actually comes from the Wellesley College yearbook. It was provided by our friends at the archives there. She continued her education at Yale, completing a PhD in English in 1938. And after she completed her degree, she taught at Dillard University, Lincoln University, and Morgan State before joining the Howard faculty in 1948. She was a scholar of 19th century British literature and taught at Howard until her retirement in 1978. And she passed away in 1997 and is buried in New Haven at Evergreen Cemetery. I think we'll skip ahead to talk a little bit about the future and then to Q&A. In terms of future work for this project, the research is ongoing. We know that we will be adding more people to this list, doing more research to add to this. We hope to connect with more descendants of the people that have been highlighted as part of this project, and with other partners at other institutions. And we really hope that this work inspires and supports additional research, independent research on individuals and other topics that are highlighted through this work. And of course, we are planning to share these online through an online platform so that more people can access these and read these stories. And lastly, if you have questions about the project specifically or have information to share about a student who attended Yale prior to 1941 and may or may not have been included in this list, we want to hear from you. And you can reach us via the Beinecke's main email address here on the screen. Like we said, this is ongoing work and we would love for you to be part of it. Thank you.